Kevin, after all these years of taking care of your mother, did you really think she would leave you anything? Richard laughed as he adjusted his Hermes tie in the mirror of the waiting room at Thompson & Associates. She told me personally that you didn't deserve a penny. I sat silently, watching my 62-year-old stepfather rehearse his winning performance from the last 7 years of his marriage to my mother. Next to him, his daughter Jessica fiddled with her cell phone, planning her next shopping spree, while his son Tyler researched sports cars on his iPad. "First I'm going to buy that BMW I've always wanted," Tyler announced with 16 years of arrogance. "Then maybe a beach house for college parties. I'm thinking about a trip to Europe," Jessica added, her 24 years of experience spending other people's money shining in her eyes. "I've always dreamed of living in Paris for a few months." Richard smiled with paternal pride as he caressed the wedding ring that still sparkled on his finger, the same ring he had placed on my mother's finger just 3 months before she discovered she had terminal cancer. "My name is Kevin, I'm 32, and I just watched my fake family celebrate the death of the woman who raised me alone for 28 years before making the mistake of falling in love again." The office smelled of varnished mahogany and greedy expectations. I responded by checking my emails, pretending to be absorbed in work while Richard continued his rehearsed monologue about how my mother had finally seen the truth about me. "She realized you never really cared," he said, his voice heavy with poisonous satisfaction. "Always too busy with your engineering career to visit her properly. Too selfish to understand that she needed a real family in her twilight years." I swallowed the bitter irony. Richard conveniently forgot about the visits he accidentally scheduled during my free time, the messages that never reached me, the times he changed doctor's appointments without telling me. The secretary appeared at the door. "Mr. Thompson is ready to see you." We walked in procession down the marble hallway, Richard in front like a conquering general, Jessica and Tyler flanking him like loyal lieutenants, and me following behind like a prisoner of war about to be publicly executed. James Thompson was waiting for us behind his wooden desk, a thick folder open in front of him. His eyes met mine for a moment, and I caught something strange in his expression, a mixture of professionalism and something that seemed almost contained amusement. "Please have a seat," he said, gesturing to the leather chairs. "Can I offer you some coffee, water? This may take a while." "Let's get right to it," Richard said, settling into the center chair as if it were a throne. "Margaret and I went over everything carefully before she left. I'm sure it's all quite clear." Tyler and Jessica exchanged knowing smiles. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I felt a strange calm, the same calm I felt during complex engineering projects when all the variables finally fell into place. If you're enjoying this family twist, be sure to subscribe to the channel to find out how this will reading would turn into something none of them ever expected. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, opening the official document. His next words would change everything, but not in the way Richard had imagined. "Very well," Mr. Thompson began, adjusting his glasses as he leafed through the documents. "Before we proceed with the official reading of Margaret Morrison's will, dated 3 years ago, I need to clarify a few details about the estate." Richard leaned forward, his eyes shining with barely concealed greed. "As I said, James, Margaret and I discussed her final wishes at length. She was very clear about her intentions. Dad always said that Mom finally understood who really cared about her," Jessica added, shooting me a look of contempt. "Kevin hardly ever showed up here in the last few years." Tyler nodded, still fiddling with his iPad. "It's true. He always had some excuse, work meetings, urgent projects, business trips. Mom was sad, but Dad always comforted her." I bit my tongue, remembering the countless times I had arrived at the hospital only to find that Richard had changed visiting hours without telling me. Of the messages that never made it to my cell phone about changes in medication or doctor's appointments. Of the times he forgot to tell me about important family gatherings. "Kevin was really selfish," Richard continued, his voice heavy with fake sadness. "Margaret used to cry after she talked to him on the phone. He always sounded irritated, rushed, like taking care of his own mother was a burden." The irony was bitter. I remembered those calls perfectly, when Richard would take the phone from her hands in the middle of our conversations, saying she was too tired to talk anymore. Or when he would unplug my cell phone from the outlets in her bedroom during my visits, claiming that electronic devices disturbed her rest. "She even told me once," Richard continued with a dramatic sigh, "that maybe Kevin was just waiting for her to die so he could sell the house and get the money. Imagine the pain of a mother realizing that about her own son." Jessica shook her head with feigned compassion. How awful. It's a good thing she had us to take care of her in her final days. Tyler muttered something about people who only care about money, as he mentally calculated his future allowance. Mr. Thompson watched this performance with an increasingly peculiar expression. He cleared his throat delicately. Mr. Morrison, before we proceed, I'd like to clarify when exactly Mrs. Morrison expressed these concerns about Kevin? Constantly, Richard replied without hesitation. Especially in the last 2 years, when she got sicker. Kevin rarely visited, and when he did, he seemed distant, always looking at his watch, eager to leave. I remembered the real reasons behind that distance. How Richard always scheduled family commitments during my free time. How he changed her medication on the days I visited, making her drowsy and confused. How he intercepted my calls, saying I was disrupting her treatment. What about medical care? Mr. Thompson asked, flipping through a few pages. Who made decisions about treatment? I did, of course, Richard said, smoothing his tie proudly. As her husband, I had complete medical power of attorney. Kevin never showed any interest in participating in these difficult decisions. Interesting how he omitted the fact that he had obtained that power of attorney 3 days after my mother's cancer diagnosis, when she was still reeling from the news. Or how he forgot to inform me about crucial meetings with oncologists, ensuring that only he was present to shape medical decisions. Dad was an angel, Jessica said, touching Richard's arm affectionately. He sacrificed so much to take care of her. He gave up his own retirement plans, spent his savings on experimental treatments. Kevin never offered financial help or emotional support. Tyler nodded vigorously. It's true. Dad always said he felt alone, carrying all this weight by himself while Kevin lived his life as if nothing was happening. The burden Richard carried included canceling my automatic deposits for her treatment, redirecting the money to personal investments. It included forgetting to renew my access as an emergency contact at hospitals. It included a systematic campaign to paint me as an ungrateful son while he positioned himself as the self-sacrificing savior. What about the estate itself? Mr. Thompson asked, his voice taking on an almost amused tone. Are you aware of all of Mrs. Morrison's assets? Richard nodded with excessive confidence. Of course. The main house is worth about $800,000. Plus the lake house, which is worth $300,000. The investments totaled approximately $1,200,000 at last check. Margaret and I reviewed everything carefully. And Kevin was aware of these figures? Mr. Thompson asked, looking directly at me for the first time. Richard laughed before I could answer. Kevin was never interested in the financial aspects. He was always very, how can I put it, detached from the family's material affairs. Unattached was an interesting way to describe how Richard systematically excluded me from all financial conversations, intercepted bank correspondence addressed to me, and made sure I never knew about the true family assets. Jessica sighed dramatically. It's sad, really. A family that could have been close, but Kevin chose to walk away. At least Mom had us in her final moments. The final moments she referred to included the last 6 weeks, when Richard changed the hospital access codes, citing security concerns. When he informed the medical staff that I was causing unnecessary stress to the patient. When he made sure I learned of her passing only 3 hours later, via cold text message. Mr. Thompson closed one folder and opened another, larger one. Well, I believe it's time to proceed with the official reading. But first, I must ask, does anyone have any questions about the validity or authenticity of this document? None, Richard declared immediately. As I said, Margaret and I discussed everything in great detail. It was then that I noticed something in Mr. Thompson's smile. It wasn't just contained professional amusement. It was the expression of someone who was about to watch justice be served in a particularly satisfying way. And as Richard adjusted his tie one last time, preparing for his announced victory, I kept my expression neutral, knowing exactly what was about to happen. What none of them knew was that my mother had been far smarter than anyone could have imagined. Perfect, Richard said, rubbing his hands together with barely concealed satisfaction. Then we can proceed with the official reading. I'm sure there will be no surprises. Mr. Thompson opened the document with an expression I now recognized as contained amusement. Very well. I, Margaret Morrison, being of sound mind and body, declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills. Get to the important parts, Richard interrupted impatiently. We all know how these things work. Jessica and Tyler exchanged knowing smiles, already imagining their future purchases. Tyler had stopped pretending to be interested in the iPad and was now paying full attention, while Jessica discreetly photographed the interior of the office to post on social media. Of course, Mr. Thompson continued. To my dear family. See. Richard whispered loud enough for me to hear. She's always been clear about who she considers real family. The words cut deeper than I expected. For years, Richard had planted these seeds of doubt in my mother's mind. Little comments about how I was always too busy to visit her properly. Remarks about how some children only show up when they need something. The irony was that I had visited my mother twice a week throughout her cancer treatment, at least until Richard started forgetting to tell me about changes in visiting hours or mixing up the days of her doctor's appointments. I leave to my beloved husband Richard Morrison, Mr. Thompson continued reading. Finally, Tyler muttered, already mentally calculating his share of the inheritance. The sum of $500. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard blinked several times, as if he hadn't processed the words correctly. Excuse me, he said slowly. Did you say 500,000? $500, Mr. Thompson repeated clearly. And to my dear stepchildren Jessica and Tyler Morrison, I leave the sum of $250 each. Jessica dropped her cell phone on the floor with a crash. Tyler turned white as a sheet, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. That's impossible. Richard rose from his chair so quickly that it nearly tipped over. Margaret and I reviewed everything. She told me personally that Kevin would receive nothing. Nothing. What about the rest of the estate? Jessica asked in a shrill voice. The house, the investments, everything else? Mr. Thompson turned a few pages. Everything else, including the main residence, the lake house, all investments, bank accounts, and personal property, I leave to my only son, Kevin Morrison. The sound that came out of Richard's throat was almost animalistic. He grabbed the edge of the mahogany table so hard that his knuckles turned white. This is fraud, he shouted. Margaret was on medication. She wasn't in her right mind. Kevin manipulated a sick and vulnerable woman. It was at that moment that something inside me finally broke. Not from sadness or pain, but from a cold, calculated anger that had been growing silently for years. Richard had spent 5 years systematically destroying my relationship with my mother. 5 years of planting lies, intercepting phone calls, altering medical schedules, and painting me as an ungrateful and greedy son. 5 years of watching my mother waste away physically while he convinced her that I didn't care about her. 5 years of pretending to be the devoted husband while systematically isolating her from anyone who might question his motives. And now, even after her death, he continued to attack me, destroying her memory with accusations of manipulation and fraud. Kevin, Richard turned to me, his eyes bloodshot with rage. Did you really think you could get away with this? You manipulated your own dying mother. Really? I replied calmly, my voice controlled despite the emotional storm raging inside me. And how exactly did I do that, Richard? He stammered, searching for words. You took advantage of her mental state. Of her medications. You waited until she was confused and vulnerable. Jessica nodded vehemently. It's true. Mom was always sleepy and confused these past few months. Kevin must have taken advantage of that. Tyler found his voice again. This has to be illegal. You can't just steal our inheritance. Her inheritance? The question came out sharper than I intended. Interesting choice of words, Tyler. You're 26 years old and you've never worked a day in your life. Jessica is 24 and spends more in a week than most people earn in a month. And Richard, I turned to my stepfather with a look that made him flinch slightly. Richard married my mother 3 months before her cancer diagnosis. How convenient. How dare you? Richard spat. I loved Margaret. I took care of her. You took care of her? I rose slowly, feeling years of pent-up anger finally finding its voice. You want to talk about taking care, Richard? Mr. Thompson cleared his throat delicately. Perhaps you should calm down. No, I said, my voice growing stronger. Let him talk about caring. Let him explain why my mother died believing that her only son didn't care about her. It was at that moment that I made a decision that would change everything. For 5 years, I had swallowed every humiliation, every lie, every manipulation, because I didn't want to cause my sick mother any more stress. For 5 years, I had allowed Richard to control the narrative, painting me as the villain while he played the hero. But now she was gone. And Richard was trying to destroy even her memory with his lies. The time had come for the whole truth to come out. And as Richard continued to yell about fraud and manipulation, I remained perfectly calm, because I knew exactly what was about to happen. What Richard didn't know was that my mother had been far smarter than he ever imagined. And far more careful. "You want to talk about manipulation, Richard?" I said, my voice cutting through his hysterical shouting. "Let's talk about how you systematically isolated my mother from all her friends and family for 5 years." Richard stopped shouting abruptly, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking," I continued calmly, "about how you canceled my visits without telling me. About how you changed her medication on the days I was coming so she'd be drowsy and confused. About how you intercepted my calls and then told her I was too busy to talk." Jessica and Tyler looked at each other nervously. For the first time since I'd known them, they looked genuinely confused. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat delicately. "Mr. Morrison, you might be interested to know that Margaret first came to me exactly 2 years ago. She was concerned about certain inconsistencies she'd noticed." "What inconsistencies?" Richard asked, his voice losing some of its previous bravado. "Well," Mr. Thompson opened another folder. "She mentioned that Kevin never received her text messages. She found that strange, considering that she saw the delivery confirmations on her phone." I watched Richard's face pale slightly. Of course he did. Kevin chose not to respond. "Interesting," I said, taking my cell phone out of my pocket. "Because I have 14 months of phone records here that show exactly the opposite. Want to see the evidence of when you blocked my number on her phone?" The silence that followed was absolute. Tyler stopped fiddling with the iPad. Jessica stopped pretending not to be paying attention. That's impossible," Richard stammered. "Margaret never said anything about that." "Of course she didn't," I replied. "Because you convinced her that I didn't care about her. That I was too busy with my life to call. But you know what's interesting about engineers, Richard? We like to document technical problems." I opened another screen on my phone. Here are screenshots of every gift I've sent her in the last 5 years. Birthday flowers, Mother's Day cards, fruit baskets during her treatment. All returned to sender with wrong address. "Dad," Jessica began, her voice uncertain for the first time. "And here," I continued, not giving Richard time to compose himself, "are the bank statements showing the monthly deposits of $3,000 I made to help with her medical treatment. Money that, interestingly, was transferred to an investment account in her name on the same day as each deposit." Richard opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. I was investing for her. To ensure a better future. A better future? I laughed without humor. "You mean like that new sports car you bought last month? Or Jessica's plastic surgery paid for with money meant for chemotherapy?" Tyler finally found his voice. "Kevin, you have to understand. We didn't know." "You didn't know?" I turned to him. "You didn't know you were spending the money I sent to help with my mother's medical bills? Interesting, because I have here the records of when you used that money to pay your online poker debts." Mr. Thompson watched this revelation with professional fascination. "Kevin, would you like to share when your mother first expressed her suspicions?" "Sure," I said, feeling years of pent-up anger finally finding its voice. If you're following this story of family manipulation, subscribe to the channel because the next revelations will show how much smarter my mother was than anyone realized. It was 2 years ago, when Richard forgot to tell me about the meeting with the oncologist. Mom called me in tears, asking why I hadn't shown up for such an important appointment. "But I told her you were traveling on business." Richard protested. "Funny," I replied, "because that day I was at the office, 15 minutes from the hospital. When I found out what had happened, I started doing some checking. That's when I discovered the first block on her phone." Mr. Thompson nodded. "And that's when Margaret called me for the first time. She was beginning to realize that things didn't make sense. Mom was always smart," I continued. It only took her a few weeks to start connecting the dots. The messages that never arrived, the gifts that never showed up, the money that mysteriously disappeared from the accounts. Richard tried one last card. Even if that's true, she would never have changed the will without telling me. It was then that Mr. Thompson smiled for the first time since we entered the room. Ah, but Mr. Morrison, the will wasn't changed. What? Richard, Jessica, and Tyler said almost in unison. The will I just read was written 3 years ago, exactly as I said. Before Mr. Morrison even married Margaret. Richard's face turned red. That's impossible. Margaret and I reviewed the will after the wedding. You reviewed one will, Mr. Thompson corrected gently. A document that Margaret specifically asked me to prepare as, let's say, a distraction. I finally allowed myself to smile. Mom always said you were greedy, Richard, but she never imagined how stupid you were. Did you really think a woman who built a real estate empire on her own would be so easily manipulated? So all this time, Jessica whispered. All this time, I confirmed, you've been spending money that wasn't yours, living in a house that wasn't yours, driving cars that weren't yours. And best of all, you documented every penny you spent, every futile purchase, every display of greed. Richard was now visibly shaking. No, it can't be true. Want more truth? I asked, pulling another document from my briefcase. Here's the complete report from the private investigator Mom hired 18 months ago. Seems you have an interesting pattern, Richard. Your first wife also died conveniently after signing a medical power of attorney to you. The silence in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mr. Thompson leaned forward. Kevin, would you like to share what your mother has discovered about Mr. Morrison's past? I'd be happy to, I replied, feeling a cold satisfaction spread through my chest. It appears that the first Mrs. Morrison died of an accidental drug overdose, just 6 months after signing a power of attorney giving Richard complete control over her finances. Richard stood up so fast he knocked over his chair. That was investigated. They never proved anything. No, I agreed. But Mom was smarter than the first wife. She documented everything. Every unauthorized medication change, every time you alter her medical instructions without consulting her doctors, every attempt to isolate her from proper care. Tyler was now visibly pale. Dad, you wouldn't do that, would you? The question hung in the air like an accusation. And as Richard struggled to find words, I knew that the moment of complete truth had finally arrived. Because what none of them knew was that my mother hadn't just uncovered Richard's plan. She had set a trap that was about to snap shut. There was never any proof. Richard shouted, but his voice had lost all authority. You're making this up. Making it up? I laughed, finally allowing years of pent-up anger to flash in my eyes. Mr. Thompson, would you like to show them what Mom really left behind? The lawyer opened a third folder, this one even thicker than the previous ones. Kevin, your mother was extremely meticulous. She first came to me exactly 24 months ago, 3 months after the wedding. That's impossible, Jessica murmured. Mom was happy. She loved Dad. Your mother was happy, I corrected, until she found out who Richard really was. Mr. Thompson pulled out a stack of documents. Margaret installed security cameras throughout the house 2 years ago. Cameras Richard didn't know about. Richard's face turned white as a sheet. She recorded everything, Richard. Every time you changed her medication. Every time you blocked my number. Every time you lied about where I was or why I couldn't visit her. And there's more, Mr. Thompson continued, pulling out another document. Margaret hired not 1, but 3 different investigators to check your background, Mr. Morrison. Tyler was now visibly shaking. Dad, what did they find? They found, I said slowly, that your first wife, Linda Morrison, had changed her will 2 weeks before her death. Leaving everything to you, Richard, instead of her children from her first marriage. They found that Linda had signed a medical power of attorney giving you complete control over her healthcare decisions just 1 week before her fatal overdose. Jessica covered her mouth with her hands. Dad. And they found, I continued relentlessly, that you had done extensive research on fatal drug interactions on her computer 3 days before her death. Richard stood up again, his hands shaking visibly. That was dismissed. It was never proven. There were never any charges. No, I agreed. Because you were very careful. But Mom was smarter. Mr. Thompson withdrew a sealed envelope. Margaret created a complete timeline comparing Linda's behavior pattern with the identical pattern Richard was following with her. The same medical manipulations. The same social isolation. The same pressure to change her will. The same medical power of attorney. But this time, I smiled coldly, there was evidence. Recordings. Medical documentation. Witnesses. Richard tried one last desperate gambit. Even if that's true, Margaret is dead. There's no way to prove that I... But Richard, Mr. Thompson interrupted gently, Margaret did not die of natural causes. The silence in the room was absolute. What? Jessica whispered. Your mother died in her sleep, as planned, Mr. Thompson explained calmly. She discontinued all cancer treatment 3 months ago, against medical advice. But she did so under strict medical supervision, with witnesses and complete documentation. She chose when and how to die, I said, my voice breaking slightly for the first time. To ensure that you could never be accused of causing her death, but also to ensure that all evidence of your attempts would be preserved. Richard collapsed into his chair like a deflated rag doll. And now, Mr. Thompson continued, we have enough evidence to reopen the investigation into Linda Morrison's death. Not only that, I added, but we have evidence of attempted premeditated murder against my mother. The unauthorized medication changes, the incorrect doses, the dangerous interactions you prescribed without consulting doctors. Tyler was crying openly now. Dad, you really tried to kill Mom? Richard looked at his children with empty eyes. For the first time since I had known him, he had no answer. And what about you two? I turned to Jessica and Tyler. You were accomplices. You helped isolate my mother, you spent money you knew was meant for her medical treatment, you lied about my whereabouts. We didn't know, Jessica cried. You didn't know, I laughed bitterly. Or didn't you want to know? How many times did you spend money I specifically sent for medication? How many times did you participate in lies about where I was? Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. Kevin, would you like me to read your mother's final letter? Please. He unfolded a handwritten sheet of paper. To my dear son Kevin, if you are reading this, then our trap has worked perfectly. Trap. Richard whispered. I pretended to believe Richard for the last 18 months, Mr. Thompson continued reading, to give us enough time to document all the necessary evidence. I pretended to be confused by medications, so he would feel safe enough to reveal his true plans. I pretended to believe that you didn't care about me so that he would let his guard down completely. Kevin, I have always known that you loved me. Every lie Richard told only confirmed my suspicions about who he really was. Now, with all the evidence gathered, they will face not only civil, but criminal consequences. The letter ended, Richard, Jessica, and Tyler, you thought you were manipulating a sick and vulnerable woman. In fact, you were studied, documented, and exposed by someone who survived breast cancer at age 40 and built a business empire on her own. You completely underestimated who you were dealing with. Richard had begun to sob. And as he finally grasped the magnitude of his defeat, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, complete peace. My mother had engineered the perfect revenge. And now it was time to watch the final pieces fall into place. 3 months later, I stood in the cemetery where my mother was laid to rest, but this time I wasn't alone. Detective Marcus Chun of the Nashville Police Department had just informed me that Richard would be formally charged with 2 counts of attempted premeditated murder. The evidence your mother gathered is irrefutable, he said, putting away his notepad. I've never seen such meticulous documentation. She really was an extraordinary woman. It was true. Mom had turned her last 18 months into an investigative operation that would have made the FBI jealous. Every recorded conversation, every documented medical change, every lie Richard told catalogued with surgical precision. The recordings were the turning point in court. The jury heard Richard discussing appropriate dosages of medications that had never been prescribed. They heard him instructing Jessica on how to keep Kevin busy during critical medical appointments. They heard Tyler laughing when Richard joked about speeding up the natural process. Your Honor, the prosecutor had declared during closing arguments, we have before us not only evidence of attempted murder, but the systematic pattern of a serial predator who targeted vulnerable women with substantial assets. Jessica and Tyler initially tried to plead complete innocence, but the evidence showed conscious participation. Jessica had searched for signs of accidental overdose on her computer 2 weeks before the final poisoning attempt. Tyler had discussed when Mom finally dies in text messages with friends, detailing his inheritance plans. The final settlement was devastating for both of them. Jessica had to return $143,000 in purchases made with money intended for my medical treatment. She also faced charges of complicity and was sentenced to 2 years in prison with probation, plus 500 hours of community service at cancer hospitals. Tyler received a harsher sentence due to his gambling debts paid with chemotherapy funds. 3 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 18 months. Upon his release, he would have to pay full restitution and participate in mandatory rehabilitation programs for gambling addicts. But it was Richard who faced the most severe consequences. The investigation officially reopened the case of Linda Morrison, his first wife. The similarities between the two cases were impossible to ignore: the same pattern of social isolation, the same unauthorized medical changes, the same power of attorney obtained under emotional pressure. "Kevin," the prosecutor explained to me before the trial, "your stepfather was a sophisticated serial predator. He didn't choose random victims. He researched specific women, recent widows or divorcees with substantial assets and adult children who lived far away." Forensic evidence re-examined in Linda's case revealed traces of medications that had not been prescribed, the same medications found in my mother's blood during her last exams. Richard had perfected his technique over the years. The trial lasted 6 weeks and was covered extensively by the local media. Richard attempted to plead innocence, hiring a high-profile criminal defense attorney who argued that he had genuinely loved both wives. But when the jury heard the secret recordings, when they saw the emails about fatal drug interactions, when they witnessed the meticulous evidence of systematic isolation, the verdict was unanimous and swift. Guilty of attempted first-degree murder. Guilty of second-degree murder in the case of Linda Morrison. Guilty of financial fraud on multiple counts. Guilty of psychological abuse of the elderly. The sentence: 25 years to life in prison for the first case, plus 15 consecutive years for the second. No possibility of parole for the first 20 years. When the sentence was read, I looked at Richard one last time. The arrogant, manipulative man had been reduced to a pathetic shadow. His hair had turned completely white, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his finally acknowledged guilt. He tried to speak to me as the officers led him away. "Kevin," he shouted over his shoulder, his handcuffs clinking, "your mother was sick. She was confused by the medications. I would never hurt her." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Justice had spoken through 12 citizens who had heard all the evidence and reached the only possible conclusion. 6 months after the trial, I received a letter in prison. Richard had written 4 pages trying to justify his actions, blaming the medical system, blaming doctors who didn't understand his wife's needs, even blaming my mother for not trusting him completely. I read the first page and threw the rest away without finishing. Some people never learn. They never accept responsibility. They never change. Richard was one of those people, a narcissist who would literally rather die in prison than admit he had caused unnecessary suffering to women who trusted him. But other people can change. Jessica, after serving her sentence, got a real job for the first time in her life, working as a nursing assistant at a rehabilitation center for the elderly. She sent me a letter 6 months later, not asking for forgiveness or trying to justify her actions, but describing how caring for vulnerable patients had given her a whole new perspective on what we had done to my mother. Tyler had a more difficult journey. Prison was especially hard for someone raised with so much privilege. But when he was released, he voluntarily entered a 12-step rehabilitation program for gambling addicts and began paying restitution by working 2 jobs. Both eventually sent me letters of apology. Genuine letters, not manipulative attempts to reduce punishment or seek favors. Letters that acknowledged the damage they had done and expressed real remorse. I responded to both. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but it does mean allowing people to grow beyond their worst moments. It means recognizing that we are all capable of both great evil and great good, depending on the choices we make. As for me, the experience has changed me in ways I never imagined possible. I sold the main house where Richard had lived. I couldn't imagine creating happy memories in a place where he had planned my mother's death. But I kept the lake house where she and I used to fish when I was a child, where we talked about life, dreams, and the future. With part of the inheritance, I established the Margaret Morrison Foundation to protect vulnerable patients. We focus specifically on helping families dealing with cancer, providing not only financial support but also legal advocacy to protect patients from financial abuse or medical negligence. In the first 2 years, the foundation has helped 63 families navigate situations similar to ours. We have prevented at least 12 cases of elder financial abuse and identified 3 situations where caregivers were potentially putting patients at medical risk. If you've been following this journey of justice and transformation so far, subscribe to the channel because we have more stories like this. Stories of ordinary people who faced predators and managed to not only survive but thrive through intelligence, courage, and unwavering determination. Every month, I visit my mother's grave and tell her about the foundation's progress. About the families we've helped. About the predators we've stopped. About the lives that have been saved because she had the courage to document her own impossible situation. "You were right, Mom," I said during my last visit, placing fresh coral roses from the garden she loved. "Intelligence always beats manipulation. Patience always beats greed. And true love always triumphs over false charm." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of the flowers I plant on her grave every spring. For a moment, I could almost hear her laugh, the same laugh she had when we planned every detail of her perfect trap. The lesson my mother taught me wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about protection, documentation, and strategic patience. It was about having enough courage to stand up to predators not only when they attack us, but before they can hurt other innocent people. It was about turning personal tragedy into collective purpose. Richard thought he was hunting easy prey, a sick, isolated woman with a distant son whom he could easily manipulate and remove from the equation. In fact, he had found a master strategist who turned her own terminal situation into such a perfect trap that he never even suspected it until it was too late. Today, as I type these words in my office, an office in a building purchased with money Richard thought he would inherit, I can say with absolute certainty that my mother won in every way that matters. Richard will die in prison, alone and forgotten. Jessica and Tyler are building better lives based on honest work and personal responsibility. And me? I've turned pain into purpose, anger into positive action, and loss into a lasting legacy. The last laugh really was ours. And it will echo for generations through every life the Margaret Morrison Foundation protects, every predator we stop, every family we save from going through what we went through. That's the real revenge, not destroying your enemy, but building something so powerful and lasting that their evil becomes irrelevant compared to the good you've created.